Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Welcome back to Hometown Cable. Let's look at another program today, and today let's talk about suicides. What do you know about suicides? We hear a lot about it. We hear a lot about them. They are often portrayed in the news, and it's always a real surprise to people when someone who's known to us decides and successfully ends his or her life. But what do you really know about them? It's a topic that I've been interested in for quite a few years, and I've studied, I've read a lot about it. I've worked with a lot of people who have threatened suicide, who have attempted it from time to time. I usually work with them afterwards. I'm happy to say that it may sound braggadocious, but for 40 years, I had to stop and think about that a minute, but for 40 years now, I haven't had anyone I've worked with commit suicide, even though I work with people quite a bit. But let's go back. What do you know about it? I've accumulated a series of questions and thought I would just share them with you. First question is, how common are they? How common? Now, the national statistics figures compiled by the Center for Vital Statistics shows that they run about 12 to 14 per year per 100,000 people. Now, how many people is 100,000 people? Oh, about the population of Clinton County and Essex County during tourist season, or Clinton and Franklin County. So that what we have here is a pretty steady rate nationally, about 12 to 14 per year per that population base. And we hear that they are increasing. Well, they seem to be. They're increasing in some age groups and some kinds of people, but they seem to be decreasing in others. Now, we also know that they're oftentimes more in the media. Of course, the media is able to be more mobile today. And then there's always the idea that we don't know how many people really commit suicide, because sometimes the evidence is just left up in the air. It leaves us with a big question. For example, a one-car accident on a perfectly dry road in the daytime, no skid marks. Sometimes things like that suggest that this was a self-inflicted death, but maybe there's no way of proving it. Suicides are increasing among children, particularly children from broken homes. There's nothing quite so devastating to a child as to lose its parents, and children whose parents suicide are particularly prone to try it. Another question that's common is, are men or women more likely to suicide? And the answer has to be split a little bit. Women are more likely to try it, men are more likely to succeed. And it's about 3-to-1 ratio. Women are becoming more successful in their attempts because women are copying the men. See, because what has happened for many, many decades now is that the methods and attempts that women use haven't been as lethal or as fatal. And so they would have more attempts registered. Men would typically use a more dangerous method. And we also see some strange differences, that the rate for women rises and then it starts going down. But the rate for men rises, levels off, and then old men it starts rising again. And it's an interesting pattern that there is a difference there in races. Old white men, whatever white means, could say Caucasian, but old white men have a relatively high suicide rate. And it's not the same with old women. Older women typically don't try suicide. And we're seeing some changes there. We also see oftentimes a question asked when you hear people talk about someone who has committed suicide or has made a serious attempt or has made what would otherwise be a fatal effort, and it's interfered with. Someone calls the right numbers like 911 and help is there in time. Excuse me, we hear the question, well, is the person mentally ill, or is the person insane or crazy or something like that? And the answer is no. Most people who are suicidal aren't mentally ill. They're not insane. They're not crazy. They're usually depressed. Most people who think seriously of suicide, of course, are depressed. It's so common to find depression in people who are thinking suicide that's one of the things we look for. And any time we're dealing with someone who is really depressed, we should make an inquiry about suicide. And here's another question that often comes up. Well, why do people kill themselves, or why do people want to? Usually, people want to because they want to get rid of pain. They're feeling pain. They have a sense of pain. And it's more of a psychological pain, a psychological hurting. Their thinking narrows. They don't know what else to do. They may feel and think that they have tried everything. And it's more of a feeling because it's, in truth, most people certainly haven't tried everything. But they really want to get rid of pain. Sometimes people don't want to die. They just want to get rid of the pain they're suffering. Another question, do children kill themselves? I know I've listened to it with different mental health specialists, questions like that. Yes, children do kill themselves, sometimes as young as 5 years of age. But it's certainly not a usual thing. What we're finding, though, is that children whose parents have split up, have broken homes, all kinds of things, children sometimes think about these things. They sometimes blame themselves, and they want to take themselves out of the picture, but children that age, very young children, most of the time they don't have a clear idea what death is. They don't really intend to die. And they may not have any real method available to them. It's scary when you run across a child who seems to have a clear idea of what death is. But the unfortunate thing is, yes, small children see it on television. They see it in movies that are portrayed. And so they seem to be thinking more of it than they used to. Here's a question that comes up. Do most people usually succeed when they attempt suicide? Happy to say no. How would you have answered that? But most people who really succeed in dying have a history of having tried it 7 or 8 times before. So the answer has to be no, most people don't succeed. The degree of seriousness and the methods that's involved. A common question that comes up would be related to the fact that people don't succeed is, do people who make a suicidal attempt really want to die? And I have to say no. I don't think people really want to die. As I said a while ago, what seems to be is that most people want to get rid of the pain. They've suffered a great deal of stress. They're under stress. They don't have a clear idea of alternatives. But they don't really want to die. And I say that because I've worked with quite a number of people over the many years I've been in the business of counseling and psychotherapy. I've yet to have one who wasn't glad to live after all of the problems were discussed or talked about, after intervention was made. People are usually glad to live. Here's another question. Does the religion a person have make a difference? The answer used to be very clear. It used to be, way back even when Emil Durkheim did his studies in the last century, it used to be quite clear that Catholics didn't commit suicide anywhere near the rate that Protestants did or people of other religions. But what we're seeing today is that people are becoming closer together. And it's not a matter of which religion they identify with that seems to be more important, but how devoted is the person to religion. In other words, a devoted follower of Judeo-Christian ethics and beliefs typically is not committing suicide. Not at all. They typically believe that it's wrong to kill oneself, typically believe that there may be eternal damnation or very serious consequences to their salvation, and so they wouldn't. There are people, however, and we get into this religious question, there are some beliefs that have been called religious lately, such as humanism, and they believe in suicide, the right of suicide, and they do indeed have a higher rate. So you have to think about which religion. The humanists believe in the right of suicide, and they're more likely to engage in that type of behavior and even perhaps encourage others to do so. Question, what is the cause of suicide? I use the question sometimes and I turn it around and say, I really don't know. For example, if I'm talking to someone who is talking suicide, I may pose the question in this way. I know, for example, that any human being has billions of cells in the body. All of them want to live, and every cell will make an attempt to make an adjustment. It's a characteristic of a living cell, is making an attempt to make an adjustment to environmental stresses. Well, if every cell in the body wants to live, I ask the question, what part of you wants to die? I don't understand. And I sometimes try to get people to describe that. Well, what part of you wants to die? I hear you say, perhaps, that you want to die or you have wanted to die in the past. Well, what part of you? Because I know every part of you in the sense of every cell in the body wants to live, makes an effort to. If we cut ourselves, we know it's going to heal. We have confidence in that. If something dramatic happens to us, a burn or cold or whatever, an assault on the body in some way, we know the body is going to make an effort to heal itself. Same thing about the brain. I knew a man who used to date neurological injuries, and he professed, and he was quite a noted neuroanatomist and neurophysiologist, Dr. Coleman de Chenard, and he used to say that you can date neurological injuries in brain tissue according to the degree and the way that the brain tried to heal itself. So I'm not sure what an answer is when we say, what are the causes? We know that people are trying to get rid of pain, and we know that people who are making that attempt sometimes are becoming narrow in their focus. How can we really tell if somebody wants to commit suicide? That's a question that comes up. There's a whole series of symptoms and behaviors that we can go by, but the simplest one is simply to ask. Just ask. I find that direct. I find it helpful. And then if we ask and we get an answer, yes, there are a whole series of things that we can do. I think what would be well would be to use that for another topic for another program. So until another time, this is Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day. Hello again. I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. What we're going to do today is to continue talking about suicide. There was so much interest in the last one on this topic, and take a little bit different approach, but to finish out some of the questions. Are some groups of people more likely to suicide than others? Yes. Yes, those people who seem to work around medicine and have ready availability to drugs are much more likely to suicide. And certain professions are more likely to suicide than others. And it's not a good thought, but actually psychiatrists have the highest suicide rate. And people who are working in the helping professions. It goes right on down, including veterinarians, who have access to drugs. There's also a group of people such as homosexuals have a higher suicide rate. And as I mentioned in the last program, old white men. And I say old white men, I'm talking about men over the age of 65. Somehow that seems to be young to me nowadays, but they have a higher suicide rate. Suicide always communicates. I sometimes ask a person, and I recommend anybody else who comes across somebody who's thinking of suicide, well, what is it that you want to communicate? What is it you want me to know or to feel about how you're feeling? And sometimes they'll just tell you. I do this particularly with young people, because so often the kids may not be really thinking of dying. They're thinking of getting a message across. They want someone to feel sorry, or to know how hurt I feel. That's the way they put it. I feel hurt. I'm in pain because of some behavior. And they may blame themselves. Children are very open about communication most of the time. So we just ask questions. And by the way, there's no evidence that asking questions increases the risk of suicide. Another question comes up, and I was in a recent training on critical incident stress debriefing and involved with that type of work. And people who have been exposed to a great deal of stress, in my opinion, oftentimes become suicidal if they have not been handled properly, but in ways other than a direct assault. Here's a handbook of suicidology. And there are 10 types of suicide. Now, most people don't think of that. Types, they say, what do you mean types? Well, 10 types of suicide. And these are other than simply a direct assault on the body. For example, there's what's called a chronic suicide. A chronic suicide. People who are addicted, and in effect they continue the behavior that's really going to be quite damaging to them, such as alcohol, such as drugs. Some of these are indirect. There's a book called The Many Faces of Suicide, which really is a book about indirect methods, indirect techniques. Get into that a little bit, but chronic suicide. And all of us know somebody who's been told to quit drinking or to quit smoking. All of us know people like that. There's another kind of suicide called suicide by neglect. For example, perhaps all of us know, I certainly do, people who may be a diabetic, what's called a brittle diabetic, who has to have insulin or has to have some consistent medication, or cardiac patient, and they go somewhere and don't take the medication with them. Go camping. We have too many people who go off sometimes without their medications. Suicide by neglect. It's sometimes rather dangerous and rather scary what risk people take this way. And we have to look at it soberly sometimes, and maybe the person on the inside is saying, I'm hurting and I want to change my life. There's another kind of suicide called sub-intentional suicide. Now, these phrases you won't run across in the newspapers or the media, but this is the way the American Suicidology Association has categorized them. Sub-intentional suicide. These are people, for example, who live quite dangerously, and all of us know people who do that. What they are doing, like consistently running red lights, disregarding weather conditions, and that's easy to do sometimes up here in the North Country, where the weather really is saying, don't go out, don't take chances on the ice and blizzards, and people, oh, I can do it, and they take off. What they're doing is engaging in very dangerous activity over and over again, and sometimes they get by with it for years, but if something happens, it's usually called an accident, isn't it? Well, it may not have been an accident at all. There's also a type called surcease, fancy word, S-U-R-C-E-A-S-E, and what that regards is that people have decided, intellectually, well, I've lived my life, I've done what I wanted to do, I have nothing to look forward to. In other words, they arrive at a position in their logic that says, why live? And to them, they're just following their logic. And I mentioned in a previous program about the humanist. Humanists believe in the right of suicide. And when they do, it's usually the surcease suicide. I've worked with a lot of people, particularly these older people, who think, well, I've completed everything. I don't want to suffer with whatever they imagine they may have. And I say, well, did you turn your switch on? Did you light your life? Are you the one that started your life? Of course, they can't answer that in a positive way. They say, well, maybe you don't have the right to turn it off. And sometimes it works. There's another kind of suicide called psychotic. Fortunately, it's not common, but when somebody is really suffering from a serious malady, they may want to get rid of the source. For example, a person who feels the devil is inside them, inside one's head, may want to get rid of the devil and take after it literally with a gun or something. There's another type of suicide called focal suicide. And there are two kinds of focal suicides. In early literature on the subject, focal suicide was first described as the action being directed to somebody else. In other words, a person dies, but everybody else blames somebody else or the circumstances to focus attention on somebody else. Another way of looking at focal suicide, though, is to focus on some part of the body. For example, psychoanalytic literature gets into such things as, well, if the hands offended thee, the eye offends thee, cut it out. Some of that is in Bible, Scripture, but focus on part of the body. You'll notice that people are very specific when they attempt suicide, and they usually don't want to be interfered with in their method. There's another kind of suicide called automation. The automated suicide, where people, let's say, are suffering some kind of pain, and so they take some painkillers, and it doesn't quite help, and so they take a little more, and they don't think it helps quite enough, and so they take a little more, and it just sort of escalates. The original intention was not to die, but to get rid of the pain again. Then there are suicides, and this is more common in young people, called accidental, where people miscalculate. For example, somebody may play Russian roulette, put a live cartridge in a chamber of a revolver. Now, the person may have spun that chamber very well, knows exactly where the shell is, and puts the shell in a chamber, goes to a party, puts a shell in, and has no thought that it's going to really die. But maybe in that particular revolver, the chamber goes the other direction. A miscalculation. Accidental suicides, where people miscalculate. And young people too often are miscalculating. They think they can do something. They think they can take the curve at, say, 70 miles an hour. They think they can stop. And they really think it. They think they can, walk across a very dangerous log or top of a dam or something like that. But they really miscalculate. Then there's the suicide called the existential. The existential is where existential philosophers think that there is no meaning in life anyway, that what we're supposed to do in life is to suffer. They have a pessimistic view. They don't believe that they have any purpose except to suffer, and so they reason themselves into believing that suicide is logical too, very clearly related to the surcease type. Then there's this strange thing called suicide by murder, where somebody sets up circumstances and gets somebody else to kill them. It usually results in charges of homicide. Indeed, it should. But suicide by murder. Sometimes people will do very dangerous things, but in doing so is going to cause somebody else to really have the responsibility. I'm thinking of somebody I know who set up in a deer hunting. Around here in the fall, we're always concerned about how many people are going to get hurt out deer hunting, and I've known people who have deliberately set up circumstances so they would get shot. What are some of the warning signs of suicide? Well, depression, I've mentioned. Sudden decrease in feeling of well-being. How about a sudden increase in cheerfulness, though, being suddenly happy about something after being depressed? How about drugs and alcohol use? Sudden increase in that. Severe family problems or problems in adjustment. Unusual, impulsive or reckless behavior, when it gets the notion that the person doesn't really care whether lives or dies. Of course, withdrawal from family, friends, and circumstances. Preoccupation with death, talking about it. Most people who are suicidal talk about it. Just give them an opportunity, they will, and so often they've left rather clear signs and patterns. Sometimes they get themselves into difficulties unusual for them, such as being arrested, going to jail, giving away favorite possessions, loss of interest in their hobbies or things that they've usually been interested in, change of eating habits, sleeping patterns, sudden neglect of one's personal appearance, significant loss of somebody close to them. These are all signs. These are all things to be on the lookout for. And what can we do about it? We can ask, we can listen, we can really listen. And if we know and find somebody who is suicidal, we can try to get them help. And they may well say, oh, no, don't bother, don't try to do that. But if you care about the person, you will. You won't leave them alone. You'll say, let's go get some help. Let's talk to somebody who knows more about it than I do. And most of us in our own families, we have to reach out for somebody else. Well, until another time, this is Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country, and welcome back to Hometown Cable. Today's topic, adolescence. We don't hear that word very much. We hear teenagers, don't we? It used to be much more common, but let's talk about those kids who are adolescent. And when does it start? Well, it's usually pretty easy to say when it starts, particularly in girls, but it's rather a difficult thing to know when it ends. Obviously, it usually begins with signs of maturity, when girls start their monthly cycles and boys start having little growth, little hormone growth, things of that nature. Well, let's talk about what is an adolescent. If you were going to try to define an adolescent right now, what characteristics would you come up with? What are these young teenagers that we talk about and say, oh, you're adolescent? Typical adolescent is hedonistic. Now, what in the world does that mean? They like to do things for the fun of it. Hedonism. Typical adolescent is labile. What in the world does that mean? It means they're mouthy. They like to talk. They do talk a lot. And if you've been around some lately, you know they talk. And sometimes it doesn't matter if they're not even talking about the same subject. They're still just talking. So lability. Adolescents typically have a low frustration tolerance. In other words, they're impatient. They get impatient easily. And, they want to talk about it, whatever. Typical adolescent is not clear about self-concept. How could the adolescent be? Everything about them is changing. Their size, their growth, their characteristics. They're developing physically, maturing. They're even changing schools, going from elementary school to middle school, things like that. Everything about them is changing. So they have an unclear self-concept. And perhaps it's fortunate that typical adolescent is indifferent to the world at large. Indifferent to the world at large. Wouldn't it be tragic if they were very concerned about the world and they had those other characteristics? Well, those are 5 characteristics. Do you know what? They're perfectly normal characteristics for the adolescent. Perfectly healthy. That's not a troubled teenager. That's just a teenager. And some people say, how can you tell the difference between trouble and teenagers? Well, let's look very realistically at what's going on. The early adolescent, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, really has a difficult time thinking about certain things. Typical early adolescent can't conceptualize history. When you think about that, they don't see history in perspective. They don't see changing in relationships the way adults do. They have difficulty understanding systems. For example, the educational system. To the early adolescent, school is books and teachers and classrooms and where to be at what time, things like that. They don't see it as a system fitting into a social wholeness at all. They see police, the black and whites or the blue and yellow. They see uniforms and badges. They have a very difficult time conceptualizing a social justice system, political systems. Well, they have difficulty seeing consequences. Now, I'm talking about the normal, ordinary, everyday adolescent has difficulty seeing consequences of their actions. They don't see it in perspective. Now, most of us parents knew this. We may not have put it in words just quite that way, but we really had a feeling about the kids, the teenagers, the young ones. Made a big difference. Yet think about it. We're seeing some changes today going on in society, and that if they don't see consequences, yet we have certain rulings and regulations in our society that give some crazy authority to any person, regardless of age, who happens to be pregnant, for example. The Roe versus Wade decision that you've heard about the abortion issue, is an example of legal jurisprudence. Strange, isn't it? Giving authority to a teenager who, by definition, may not be able to tell the consequences of one's actions. It's strange. We also have some changes going on in society, like females maturing earlier. Now, anybody who is 40 years of age certainly has witnessed this. The girls seem to mature earlier than their parents and grandparents. And indeed, there's even a schedule. They seem to be maturing 6 months per decade. In other words, for every 10 years age difference, the girls have been maturing 6 months earlier. Now, that's physical maturity. That's not mental maturity. Physical maturity. Think of the consequences of that. We see all around us today 11 and 12-year-olds who look physically mature. And for those of us with a little gray on top, things like that, or I used to have gray on top, now I just have bald spots. But those of us who have seen more than one generation, 2 generations, we see what looks like an 18-year-old and a 12-year-old. An 18-year-old body with a 12-year-old mind. Now that's a problem. It's a problem because these girls at younger ages are more attractive to older men. They're attractive to older men, but they don't have the intellectual capacity to go along with the body. That's not their fault. The girls didn't ask for these changes. And what we're seeing simultaneously with the adolescent today, we're seeing more and more permissiveness in society. In other words, parents and schools and even religious leaders are becoming more and more permissive about what they will allow the teenager, the young adolescent to do. And it should be the opposite. Because simply by the fact and by reason of the fact that the young adolescent is physically more mature, there should be more control if there's not simultaneous mental maturity to go along with it. We really don't have any evidence that mental maturity has improved, male or female. So what we're seeing is very young-looking boys, same age as mature-looking girls. And the boys are trying to act and keep track of that, and all of you know that girls mature about 2 years earlier than boys. And nobody has really come up with a good explanation of why that maturity change has come about. But we know that the mental maturity has not been part of it. Think about it. more permissive societies, more physically mature, more sexually mature person with fewer restraints. It's going the opposite direction, isn't it? And yet we have more and more authority being given even by the courts, as I mentioned a while ago. We add these problems together. We have pornography. We see pornography all over the place. What does that do? Well, evidence shows very clearly that it certainly instills in young minds all sorts of things. And old minds too. Let's don't be peculiar about that or so parochial. Pornography by definition is sexually stimulating or erotic material that's illicit. That's a definition if you want to look it up in Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. We put this kind of thing like MTV, which seems to be a series of pornographic displays, largely, over and over again. We put that in young minds. It's strange, isn't it? We talk about the young adolescent, but not one of the problems that I've mentioned has been caused by the adolescent. The adolescent didn't cause early maturity. They didn't cause TV programming to be what it is. No, those are the adults. Even the parents pick their peers. We hear a great deal about peer pressure. The kids trying to keep up with each other and do what's this and what's that for each other. Peer pressure? Sure, it's out there. Where's it come from? The parents pick the peers. And somebody say, well, how do you know that? What do you mean by that? Well, the parents pick where the child lives, what school the child goes to, what church the child goes to. Therefore, the parents pick the peers, what neighborhood they're going to live in. Okay, these are some problems about adolescence. What can we do about it? Well, first, let's say that we can have an attitude adjustment. We can do something. I used to have fun because when I was teaching courses in adolescence, I would tell the students, I'm going to ask you a question on this first examination, and I'm giving you the answer now. And even though I would say that and give the answer, more often than not, people come back and give the wrong answer. Question, true or false? You can't tell teenagers what to do. And most people, these were college students and even graduate courses, would say that's true. You can't tell teenagers what to do. Well, that's not correct. If we don't, who will? You remember the characteristics of teenagers? Indifference to the world at large, low frustration tolerance. They like to talk a lot. They have an unclear self-concept. They don't have good way of dealing with consequences of behavior. So, we need to assure the teenagers what they need to do. We need to influence their behavior. We can have a change of attitude. We know it's much easier to influence the future than it is the past. You show me someone who can influence the past, I'll be a very good student. I'll try. We can adhere to substantive ethics. We can believe in something ourselves, and this will be good for the teenagers. If we believe in substantive ethics, we are not then clearly accepting procedural ethics or situational ethics. In other words, today we have a society that seems to be building up more and more the idea that if you go about doing something in proper method, that makes it right, regardless of what you're doing. That's called procedural ethics. We're teaching young people that today, too. We're teaching situational ethics in too many of our schools. Very clearly it says if you want to do something, if you really thought about it, and you think it's right, it's right. No. We can expect our young adolescents to learn and to hold them accountable for learning. We know they're going to learn. So why not set the example and set the materials there for them to learn? Whether it's at home, whether it's in school, whether it's in church, wherever it may be. Those things we can do. We need to teach what we want them to learn. And we need to expect compliance. Reward when they do well, and certainly set up some fashion of discipline when they do not do, when they don't try. We need to be consistent, we need to be firm, we also need to be kind. Children today don't have a special set of needs any different from the needs of people in Socrates' time, Plato. Now, some of you read what Socrates said about the young people. It sounds very easy, like a description of young people today. But what he was really describing were the normal characteristics of adolescence. The usual. We need to keep it up, and to be willing to keep it up. To expect compliance. Sure, they're going to fall down, but so are we. And it's not whether or not we fall down that's so important. It's how we get up. And we need to teach the children how to get up when they fall. Kids today have a much easier time materially in their lives, but they have a much harder time knowing what's right and wrong. It's kind of fuzzy out there for them, and we need to give them a hand. We need to expect them to learn and to show them how. They're not really different. And big doses of acceptance and love goes a long ways. Why not? Until another time, this is Dr. John Middleton. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country, and welcome back to Hometown Cable. Today's topic, something we hear a lot about, effective communications. Let's see if I can be an effective communicator. And it takes two, doesn't it? If we're going to communicate, somebody has to initiate the message, somebody has to receive the message. Too often we see in families, the husband may be talking as if on channel X, and the wife is listening as if on channel Y. Well, let's talk about effective communications. Starting with sharing some time. To be effective, we have to share some time. When's the last time you scheduled time to be together? Intending to be together. Really intending just to spend time together. Too often in marriage counseling we hear people describe putting themselves last on the scheduled day, after the evening news, after everything else, after the children are gone to bed or wherever the children go these days. Yet, maybe having 2 minutes and saying, yeah, bye, good night, what do you want to say before I go to sleep? No. We need to share an interest. A lot of people go around saying, but we don't have anything in common. Yet these same people, when you ask them, will describe things they did in common before they got married. I find that common. I really do. I ask people, what did you do before you got married? How did you spend your time? What activities did you involve yourself in? And they usually come up with a happy list of things that they did together. And most of the time it didn't involve something that cost a lot of money. Oftentimes I hear people say, well, we can't do so-and-so because it costs too much. Or we don't have the time. When don't you have time for yourself? This time factor is important to consider. So far as I know, now correct me if I'm wrong, but so far as I know, all of us have 24 hours a day. We have the same amount. I think that's correct. It's what we do with it and what priorities do we put on ourselves. Well, that's important, because you start talking to people about effective communications and most of the time they'll come back with that time problem. Here's another suggestion about effective communication, and that's a two-question response. Two-question response. Someone says something to me, I try to think of two questions about the topic before changing topics. If you listen to most people's conversation, they're constantly changing topics, just jumping from one topic to another. Most of the time because it's evidence that the people involved, aren't interested in the topic mentioned. So they'll mention something that's more interesting to them at the time. 2-question response. I recommend it for couples sometimes. Recommend it for anybody. Someone comes up, says something to me about something. I'll try to ask 2 questions about that particular topic. And maybe the person is satisfied, but it shows I'm genuinely interested, that I'm willing to pursue the topic. Another one, of course, you've heard this all your life, about body language. Look at the person talking to you, and look at the person you're talking to. We see a lot of communication going on. I see it all the time. And go into family homes, go into some places, observing, and people are talking to each other without ever taking their eyes off the television set. Sort of talking out the side of their mouth, yes, what do you think about that? Do something. You can do that with a parent, a child, anybody really. In other words, pay attention to the person you're talking about. Pay attention to the person you're talking to. Pay attention to the person you're listening to. If you're really listening, it logically follows you're going to look at the person, because you're going to hear better. Individual attention. When's the last time you had individual attention? Most people don't even know how to think about individual attention. Undivided attention. Children need it. For many years now I've been recommending 5 minutes a day, and that doesn't sound like very much, does it? 5 minutes a day of really undivided attention. Well, we also need it as adults. I can't get people, and I have long since learned not to try to get them to spend 5 minutes a day. So I start with 2 minutes. Try 2 minutes. To really focus on somebody for 2 minutes without any distractions, not while you're doing something, not while you're doing the dishes or repairing a car or doing something else or sweeping the floor or reading a book. Undivided. And you're probably going to be met with, what are you looking at? What are you staring at? Well, you don't have to stare. 2 minutes. Undivided attention. If you really develop that awareness of the person, you take in the whole person, then some of these other suggestions fall in place. What is it you see about the person that you like? Bound to be something. Why not comment on it? Why not compliment what you see that you like? Why not compliment the behavior that you like? See, most of us are sort of programmed to complain what we don't like. But why not talk about what we do like? Such as, when you do that, it makes me feel very good, or I like that, or I have a warm feeling when you say something like that, or do something, whatever it may be. Instead of coming up with some negatives. And even sometimes if it is on the negative, I've mentioned it before, but we can even reframe a negative, such as somebody who's nagging. You stop and you listen to the person nagging, and you can say something like, well, I'm very glad that you're paying so much attention to what I'm doing. It really shows you're interested. And I appreciate that much interest. That'll usually take care of the nagger. And how about accepting responsibility for our unclear messages? Saying, wait, I didn't quite hear that, or would you repeat that? I apparently wasn't paying attention enough, or my mind wandered a moment, or whatever the honest circumstance is. I don't believe in telling untruths. But why not accept responsibility? said, I really want to hear what you're saying. That sounds interesting. Would you repeat it, please? Most people are glad to. Sometimes they're taken back by interest, because so often our communication is just sort of like these little things on the video games. Their mouths are working, but there's no real sense to what's going on. Ask for clear explanations if you don't understand. Why not? Too often we think we're in a hurry and we don't have time for a clear explanation, but we do. Of course we do. We can avoid bickering. You ever been in a home where you had wall-to-wall bickering? You've seen it. Some of you grew up in a house with wall-to-wall bickering. People didn't know how to relate to each other unless they were complaining. And there are some cultural differences. Some cultures do this routinely, others don't. But what about your household? Can you avoid wall-to-wall bickering? Of course you can. Number one, does it get you what you want? Is your behavior really leading to what you want? What is your plan? Do you have a goal? That helps. People who have goals are more interesting. People who have goals are certainly much more exciting to talk to. They themselves are more interested in what they're doing. So why not establish some goals? We can avoid placating. If we're interested in people, we just won't agree with everything the person says just to be agreeable. We can be interested in what the person is doing and saying and avoid the major problem of agreeing, like yes dear, no dear, whatever you say dear. After a while that gets very old, doesn't it? We can avoid blaming. We take responsibility ourselves. Simplest sort of thing, isn't it? Instead of saying, oh, it's your fault, you don't pay attention, or you don't do this, you don't do that. If only you would, whatever. No. Let's start with ourselves. Let's be the effective communicator. We can avoid distractions. And all of us do that sometimes, even with the very best of intentions. Someone says something to us and we're not really interested in following. Change the topic, distract, change the subject, and we can also avoid the detailed questions. When we get into very strong detailed questions, sometimes it's disturbing. We can ask ordinary questions about subjects. We don't have to just keep on and on and on, because sometimes we're trying to drive the person away with that kind of questioning. Here's something that I've watched, I've observed, I've looked at quite a bit here in the North Country. I'm suggesting that people start omitting profanities, obscenities, and vulgarities in their conversation. Omit them. Leave them out. Here's the reason. I find that patterns of this sort of thing, as I observe people, patterns of this sort of language take the place of good communications. People use them as fillers. Most of the time they're not being diabolical, they're not being deliberately mean, they're not being anti-religious. That's not their intention. But they're using vulgarities, profanities, and obscenities as fillers in a conversation. And they don't communicate. They really don't say much. Because you can listen to people sometimes, and I know a couple of people I have in mind who start this sort of thing, and that's about every other word. And at the end of a so-called conversation, one doesn't know more about the subject than one started. You think about it and substitute real words and descriptive language that you really want. I'm well aware that for some people descriptive language means vulgarities, profanities, and obscenities. But why not start communicating better and leaving them out? See, most of the time, we don't like when children use that language with us. I've heard parents scream and quarrel and holler and say, watch your mouth, when they were throwing out the very words. Where children learn it? They learn typically from the parents. There are better ways of relating. Why don't we review what it is that we want to say and to share? What do I want to know about you? What do I want you to know about me? What do I want you to know about what I know about a certain subject? And what can I learn from you? A wise person can learn from a fool, and a fool can't learn from anybody. Now, most of us are certainly in the wise category. If we want to, we can learn, and we're going to learn. So why not open the communications up a little better? Just ordinary kinds of things. I find that clear communications, even in a family that's loaded with anger and hostility, clearing the communication pattern is sometimes all that's needed. People are so full of feelings and tensions, they have trouble expressing themselves. Most of the time because they're on the defensive. They think they're going to be shot down or cussed at or something's going to happen if he really or she really expresses the feeling. Well, why not start with the positives? If we're expressing feelings, why not start with positive feelings? They don't have to be negative. We don't have to insult somebody's heredity in order to share a feeling with them. We don't have to question the legitimacy of their birth just to express a feeling. Why not say what we want? Why not share what we want and ask for it? Too often we're afraid to ask. If we set a goal, we set some time, we have something that we believe in, are interested in, and we want to share it, we're probably going to be willing to share what somebody else wants to give to us in return. We can express our appreciation. And then there's another thing about communicating we need for effective communications. What happened to our sense of humor? I see so many people with a scowl on their face. I found by looking in the mirror that as I've grown older, and I'm happy to say I've grown older, I'm sure I would have been disappointed if I'd quit growing old. But it's so easy for people to think I'm unhappy in appearance. We tend to stereotype old people and think they're old and grumpy. Well, old but not necessarily grumpy. Wrinkles, but they don't hurt. These wrinkles don't hurt. But what about our sense of humor? I find that so many people take life too seriously. And sometimes even in the intensity of serious psychotherapy, I have to come back and remind people that perhaps it isn't quite as serious as the description would lend itself to believe. Take life easier. Look at it with a sense of humor. Develop it if you don't have it. Improve on it on the one you already have, but not at other people's expense. Until another time, this is Dr. John Middleton.